They say power belongs to those who enforce the law, but what happens when the enforcers don't even know the law they're breaking? Two cops, one woman, a routine stop, or so they thought. They saw her skin before they saw her humanity. They assumed guilt before they even asked a question. And when she dared to challenge them, they threw her in cuffs, convinced they had control. But here's what they didn't know. She wasn't just another woman walking home. She wasn't just another name in the system. And she definitely wasn't someone they could break. Because with one phone call, the entire power dynamic shifted. The officers who thought they had all the authority, suddenly, they were the ones panicking. What happens when those who abuse their power get exposed? What happens when the justice system meets someone who refuses to bow? And what happens when the wrong arrest turns into a career-ending mistake? This isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call. Stay until the end, because this is the moment everything changed. It was one of those thick, humid nights in Crestwood, Georgia, where the air felt heavier with every breath. The kind of night where the heat lingered long after the sun had disappeared, making the pavement radiate warmth like an unshaken ember. Streetlights buzzed dimly above the sidewalks, casting long shadows that danced with the occasional passing car. Nia Caldwell walked alone, her footsteps rhythmic against the quiet street. She had just left Bailey's Cafe, a cozy little spot she often visited after work. The aroma of roasted coffee still clung to her hoodie, a comforting contrast to the unease settling in her chest. At 34, Nia was the kind of woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. Tall, lean, and athletic, she moved with the effortless grace of someone who knew how to be invisible when necessary. But tonight, that skill was failing her. Her deep brown skin gleamed under the soft glow of the streetlights, and her sharp, intelligent eyes took in everything, cataloging details out of habit. The subtle shift in the air, the muffled music from a nearby house party, the distant bark of a dog, and the police cruiser. She had noticed it 3 blocks back, moving slowly, too slowly. At first, she ignored it. Maybe they were looking for someone else. Maybe it was just her instincts acting up. Maybe the flash of headlights hit her like a punch. The sudden whoop-whoop of the siren made her breath hitch. A patrol car screeched to a stop just a few feet away. She stopped walking, stood still. 2 doors swung open. "Hey, hands where we can see them!" Her pulse quickened. Here we go. The officers moved quickly, stepping out in practiced unison. The older one, Officer Bradley Huxley, was broad-shouldered, pushing 40, his face ruddy from years in the Georgia sun. He had the kind of build that suggested he spent more time giving orders than chasing suspects. His partner, Officer Darren Cole, was younger, leaner, his blonde hair cropped military short, his posture wound tight with something like nervous energy. They weren't here for a friendly chat. Nia raised her hands, keeping her movements slow, deliberate. "Evening, officers," she said evenly, keeping her voice calm. "Something wrong?" Bradley took a step closer, eyes scanning her from head to toe in that way men like him did, not looking at her, but through her. "You match the description of a suspect," he said, that old, tired line. Nia's jaw tightened, but she didn't react. She had heard it before. Every black person had heard it before. She could have asked for details, could have played the game, pretended to be surprised, pretended to believe this was just a mistake. But something in Bradley's tone told her the details didn't matter. "May I ask what suspect?" she inquired instead, tilting her head slightly. Bradley's lips twitched, just a flicker of irritation before he smoothed it over with forced patience. "Just answer the question, ma'am." Nia didn't move, didn't blink. The street was still. A house down the block had its porch light on. Someone was watching, half hidden behind a curtain. She wasn't alone, but that didn't mean anyone would step in. "I'd like to know why I'm being stopped," she said again, her tone steady. Darren shifted on his feet, the younger one, the follower, the one who was still learning the rules of men like Bradley. The silence stretched. Bradley's patience snapped first. "Put your hands on your head." A direct order. For a fraction of a second, Nia considered her options. She could end this right now. One word, one move, and they'd be the ones scrambling to apologize. But she didn't. Instead, she gave them what they wanted. She placed her hands on her head, and Bradley grabbed her. The push was harder than necessary. Her chest slammed against the hood of the police car, the heat of the engine seeping through her clothes. "Seriously?" she muttered under her breath. Bradley yanked her arms behind her back, locking the cuffs around her wrists with a sharp, metallic click. "Resisting a police officer," Darren murmured, barely loud enough for her to hear. "Might be something else too. We'll see." She let out a slow breath, staring at the cracked asphalt beneath her. It was happening again. The same story, the same script, and they thought they were in control. The ride to the station was silent, aside from the occasional crackle of the radio and the hum of the engine. Naya sat in the back seat, her wrists aching from the too tight cuffs. She watched Bradley's reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked satisfied. Darren, on the other hand, kept glancing at her through the side mirror. Something about her didn't sit right with him. She didn't look scared. She didn't look angry. She just watched. "You got a record, Miss Caldwell?" Darren asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Naya raised a brow. "Why don't you check your system?" she said smoothly. Bradley chuckled. "Oh, we will, but we don't need a record to hold you for questioning. Plenty of ways to keep someone in a cell overnight." "Is that right?" Bradley's smirk widened. He liked this part. The power. She leaned back against the seat. Let them have their moment. They had no idea who they had just put in the back of their car. As they pulled up to the station, the reality of the night settled over Nia like a second skin. She had spent years in the shadows, blending into places where she didn't belong, gathering information, uncovering secrets most people never realized existed. She had faced criminals, arms dealers, warlords, men whose hands were stained with real blood. And yet here she was, arrested for walking down the street. Bradley opened the car door and grabbed her arm. "Let's go." She stepped out, her face unreadable. The truth was coming, and when it did, the whole damn station would feel the impact. The air inside the Crestwood Police Department was thick with the stench of old coffee and sweat, the kind of stale odor that clung to overworked officers and metal desks covered in paperwork that no one ever truly read. The fluorescent lights flickered, humming softly, casting a sickly yellowish glow over the dull gray walls. Naya Caldwell sat in an interrogation room, wrists cuffed to a cold metal table bolted to the floor. The chair beneath her was uncomfortable, designed to make people squirm, to remind them that this wasn't a place for comfort. But she didn't squirm. She sat still, breathing evenly, her deep brown eyes scanning the room, not in panic, not in fear, but in quiet calculation. The camera in the corner, slightly tilted, the door, thick and reinforced, with a chipped handle. The ventilation grate in the ceiling, just big enough for sound to carry, but not for anyone to slip through. She had been in places like this before. Interrogation rooms in foreign countries, under dimmer lights, with men who had far more power and far fewer rules than these officers. And she had walked out of all of them. The only difference now, the people sitting across from her thought they were in control. The door creaked open. Officer Bradley Huxley strolled in first, carrying himself like a man who had won something. His bulky frame filled the small space, and his face was set in a smirk, the kind of grin that came from years of knowing he could do whatever he wanted and get away with it. Behind him, Officer Darren Cole followed, quieter, more hesitant. He wasn't new to the job, but he wasn't hardened like Bradley. Not yet. There was still that flicker of uncertainty in his movements, the way his hands stayed near his belt but never quite rested on his gun. Bradley tossed a manila folder onto the table. It slid toward Nia with a whisper of paper on steel. "Let's cut to the chase, Miss Caldwell," he said, dragging out her name like he was testing how it tasted. "You want to tell us what you were really doing out there tonight?" Naya didn't blink. "I already told you. I was walking home." Bradley snorted. "Yeah, sure." He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down with a heavy thud. "See, here's the thing. A lot of folks say they're just walking home when they're up to something. And you?" He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the table. "You look like you might be up to something." She tilted her head slightly. "And what exactly do I look like?" Bradley grinned, slow and deliberate, his eyes gleaming with something smug. "Oh, I think you know." Naya let the silence settle. She could feel Darren's discomfort growing beside him, the way he shifted on his feet, the way his eyes flickered between her and his superior. He wasn't sure about this. That made him dangerous. Not because he was cruel like Bradley, but because he was hesitant, because he was caught in the middle, because he hadn't yet decided whether he was the kind of man who followed orders blindly or the kind who stopped to ask if those orders were right. Bradley flipped open the folder, even though they both knew there was nothing in it, just blank sheets of paper meant to intimidate her. Now, maybe you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time, he continued, pretending to skim non-existent information. But I got a feeling that's not the case. He tapped the folder. See, we got reports of some shady business happening around that area. A lot of new faces moving in, a lot of transactions that don't make sense. And wouldn't you know it, a lone woman walking around at night, that just screams, "Look at me." Nia arched a brow. Is that how police work now? Random people become suspects just for existing? Bradley's smirk didn't waver. Oh, we're a lot more thorough than that. And see, resisting arrest, that's already not looking too good for you. You shoved me against a car for asking a question. Bradley spread his hands. And yet, here we are. Darren finally spoke, his voice quieter, uncertain. Look, Miss Caldwell, he started, carefully choosing his words. If you just cooperate, this will go a lot smoother for you. Nia turned her gaze to him, her expression unreadable. Cooperate with what exactly? She asked. You don't have anything on me. You don't have a crime. You don't even have a reason for stopping me in the first place. Darren hesitated. Bradley cut him off. What we do have, he said, voice sharp, is the authority to hold you for questioning. And the longer you sit here, the more we start thinking, maybe there is something we should be looking into. A threat. A weak one. Nia studied him. The way he leaned back slightly, enjoying the illusion of power. The way his fingers drummed lazily on the table. She had seen men like him before. Men who relied on their badges not as a responsibility, but as a weapon. She exhaled slowly, flexing her fingers against the cuffs. You sure you want to go down this road? She asked. Bradley chuckled. Oh, sweetheart, I love this road. Darren shifted uncomfortably. You know, Nia continued, her voice level, I'd be careful if I were you. There's a saying, the most dangerous person in the room is the one who says nothing. Bradley's smile faltered, just a little. But Darren, he swallowed hard, because for the first time that night he realized she wasn't afraid. Outside the interrogation room, a young officer named Ethan Carter sat at his desk, typing her name into the system, expecting the usual. Maybe an old traffic ticket, maybe a minor record. Instead, the screen flashed. Restricted access, level 5 clearance required. Ethan frowned, typed again, same result. He sat back in his chair, his stomach twisting into knots. Something was very, very wrong. Slowly, he turned to Bradley, who was still smirking inside the interrogation room, completely unaware that everything he thought he knew was about to come crashing down. Ethan licked his lips, his voice uneasy. Sir? Bradley didn't look up. What? Ethan swallowed. You might want to see this. Bradley sighed, irritated, standing up with a heavy grunt. Darren, keep an eye on her. He stepped out of the room, completely oblivious to the shift happening. Darren lingered a moment longer, staring at Nia. She held his gaze, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. You don't know who I am, do you? She murmured. Darren said nothing, but the sweat forming at his temple told her all she needed to know. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Nia Caldwell's wrists, a constant reminder that, in their eyes, she had already been judged. The interrogation room smelled of sweat and stale coffee, the kind of scent that lingered in the walls of police stations where men like Officer Bradley Huxley thought their power was absolute. The dim yellow light overhead flickered slightly, buzzing like an impatient fly trapped in the still air. Nia sat motionless, her back straight, her face unreadable. The cuffs locked her to the metal table, but she didn't fidget. She didn't squirm. She waited. Across from her, Officer Darren Cole stood near the door, arms crossed, shifting from foot to foot as if his body couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be in that room. He wasn't looking at her. Not directly. His gaze flickered toward the table, the walls, anywhere but her face, because deep down, Darren knew. This wasn't right. The door creaked open, and Bradley strode back in, his confidence still plastered all over his face, though there was something, just a flicker, of irritation behind his smug grin. You're lucky, Caldwell, he announced, dropping into his chair. Looks like you're getting processed sooner than expected. He leaned forward, resting his thick arms on the table, smirking as if he knew something she didn't. "But I gotta say," he continued, "I've seen a lot of people come through here. And you're one of the most interesting." Naya didn't respond. She just watched him. Bradley let the silence stretch before continuing, his voice thick with fake sympathy. "See, here's what's gonna happen. We'll book you, hold you for a while, maybe a day, maybe two, long enough for some charges to stick. Maybe resisting arrest, maybe obstruction. We'll figure something out." Darren flinched slightly beside him. "But hey," Bradley shrugged, "cooperate, and maybe you get out sooner. Maybe we don't push too hard." This was his game, the same tired game men like him played over and over again, betting that intimidation and time would make people break. But Nia wasn't like the others. She exhaled slowly. "Tell me something, Officer Huxley," she said, tilting her head just slightly. "Do you actually believe you're in control of this situation?" The smirk on Bradley's face twitched, just for a fraction of a second. Then he chuckled. "Sweetheart, I don't believe it. I know it." Naya let out a small, amused breath. "That's cute," she murmured. Bradley's smirk dropped, and that's when it happened. The knock on the door, sharp, authoritative. Bradley's eyes flickered toward it, irritation crossing his face. "Not now," he barked. But the door opened anyway. And Officer Ethan Carter, the rookie who had run her name, stepped inside. His face was pale, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. Bradley turned to him with barely concealed annoyance. "What the hell is it, Carter?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting to Nia, just for a second, before settling back on Bradley. "Sir," he said, voice tight, "we need to talk. Now." Bradley let out a heavy sigh, clearly ready to chew the kid out, but something in Ethan's face stopped him. For the first time that night, Bradley hesitated. "Watch her," he muttered to Darren, before standing up and stomping toward the door. The second it clicked shut, Nia turned her attention to Darren. He was still standing there, arms crossed, but his stance was different now. Less authoritative, more uncertain. She studied him for a moment. "You're starting to figure it out, aren't you?" she asked. Darren blinked, his jaw tightening. "Figure what out?" She tilted her head slightly. "That you made a mistake." Darren shifted on his feet, eyes flickering toward the table before back to her. "Look, you don't have to say it," Naya cut in smoothly. "I can see it all over your face." Darren clenched his jaw. "We were just doing our job." Nia smiled, but it wasn't warm. "That's the problem, Officer Cole. You think you were doing your job, but what you were actually doing, that was something else entirely." Darren didn't respond, because deep down he knew she was right. Outside the room, Bradley stood with Ethan near the processing desk, his face growing redder with each passing second as the young officer stammered out an explanation. "There's a restricted flag on her profile," Ethan was saying, voice low, nervous. "Level 5 clearance, sir. We aren't even supposed to have access to her name. That's federal. High level." Bradley's face twisted. "You're telling me she's got some kind of special protection?" I don't know," Ethan stammered. "I just know that whatever's in her file, we don't have clearance to see it." Bradley clenched his teeth. "Run it again." "I did. Same result." For the first time all night, Bradley didn't look cocky. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, realizing he might have just taken a step too far. Ethan licked his lips. "Sir, who is she?" Bradley didn't answer, because at that moment, he had no idea. Back in the interrogation room, Nia exhaled softly as the tension in the station thickened, spreading like a slow-moving storm. She looked at Darren, whose rigid posture was starting to falter, and decided to throw him one last bone. "You want to know what happens next?" she asked, her voice casual. Darren didn't answer, but the way his hands flexed slightly at his sides told her he was listening. She leaned forward just a fraction, the cuffs clinking softly against the table. "You're about to see your boss get very nervous," she said, her tone almost conversational. "And when he comes back through that door, he's not going to be nearly as confident as he was a few minutes ago." Darren exhaled sharply through his nose. "And why's that?" Nia smiled. "Because the second you put those cuffs on me," she said smoothly, "you didn't just arrest a woman." She let the words hang for a second, let them settle. "You arrested something a lot bigger than you." Darren's throat bobbed as he swallowed. And then, just like clockwork, the door burst open. Bradley stood there, his face no longer smug, no longer arrogant, For the first time since she had seen him, he looked afraid. And Naya, she just smiled. Because now, the real game had begun. The room felt smaller now. Not because the walls had moved, not because the air had changed, but because the power in the room had shifted. Officer Bradley Huxley stood in the doorway, his face a shade paler than before, the smug confidence that had been his armor now splintering at the edges. He tried to cover it up, standing taller, puffing out his chest, but Naya Caldwell saw right through it. She had seen men like him crumble before. The moment they realized they weren't in control, their entire demeanor cracked like glass under pressure. And right now, Bradley was cracking. Behind him, Officer Ethan Carter lingered just outside the room, his fingers nervously gripping a clipboard he clearly wasn't reading. He had been the one to deliver the bad news. Nia wasn't some random suspect. Her file was locked behind Level 5 clearance, a classification so high that no one in that station had the authority to access it. And Bradley knew what that meant. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a disaster. The silence stretched. Naya remained seated, wrists still cuffed to the steel table, her expression unreadable. Across from her, Officer Darren Cole shifted in his stance, a muscle ticking in his jaw. He hadn't spoken since Bradley re-entered the room, but Nia could feel the tension radiating off him. He was thinking, processing, realizing. She could see it happening in real time, the slow unraveling of whatever illusion he had walked into this night believing. Finally, Bradley exhaled through his nose, slamming the door shut behind him. Bang! Ethan flinched outside, but Bradley ignored him. He strode back to the table, lowering himself into his chair with forced ease. "Well," he said, plastering a grin back onto his face. "That was interesting." Naya raised an eyebrow. "Was it?" Bradley chuckled, but it sounded forced. "Turns out you're more important than we thought. Congratulations." Nia didn't respond because she didn't need to. Bradley leaned forward, folding his hands together on the table. "So, let's talk." "Let's not," Nia countered smoothly. Darren's gaze snapped to her, as if surprised by how calmly she dismissed the officer sitting across from her. Bradley let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Come on now, you don't want to clear this up? Maybe explain why a woman with restricted clearance is wandering around Crestwood in the middle of the night." Nia tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Is that what you're worried about? Or are you more concerned about what happens next?" Bradley's smile twitched. Darren glanced between them, his frown deepening. "Listen," Bradley continued, voice dipping into something almost resembling reason. "I get it. Maybe this was a misunderstanding. Maybe you got caught up in something bigger than yourself. And if that's the case, I'd be happy to help you. But I need you to help me first." Naya exhaled slowly, eyes flickering toward the one-way mirror on the opposite wall. She knew exactly what was happening behind it. Someone, maybe the precinct captain, maybe an external officer, was standing there, watching, waiting to see if she slipped up, if she cracked, if she gave them anything they could use. It was a strategy. Keep the suspect talking, make them comfortable, make them think cooperation is their best option. Unfortunately for Bradley, Naya had spent years perfecting that same tactic. She let her gaze settle back on him. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice even measured. "You're going to uncuff me. You're going to apologize, and then you're going to pray that when I leave this room, I decide not to ruin your career." Darren inhaled sharply. Bradley blinked, and then he laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had been hit in the mouth but was too stubborn to admit it. "Wow," he breathed. "You got some nerve, I'll give you that." "You'll be giving me a lot more than that soon," Nia replied. Bradley's jaw clenched, a crack in his mask. The tension in the room grew heavier, thick like a storm about to break. And then, knock, 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 another interruption. Bradley turned sharply toward the door, his irritation clear. "What now?" The door opened just enough for Ethan to poke his head in, looking paler than before. "Sir," he said, voice tight, "we have a call coming in, for her." Silence. Bradley didn't move, didn't breathe. "What?" he finally said. Ethan swallowed. A direct call, from Langley. The air in the room shifted. Darren tensed. Bradley's hands curled into fists, and Naya, she smiled, because now, the game was over. For a long moment, Bradley just stared at Ethan, as if waiting for him to take it back, as if hoping he had misheard. as if the night wasn't spiraling completely out of his control. "Langley?" he repeated, voice suddenly hoarse. Ethan nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir. CIA headquarters." Bradley's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He was trying to think, trying to find a way to salvage this, to fix whatever mess he had just thrown himself into. But there was no fixing this, because the second that phone call went through, it wouldn't just be Nia walking out of this room. It would be the weight of every single consequence they had been trying to avoid. Darren spoke first. His voice was quiet, uneasy. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his gaze locked onto Nia, like he was seeing her for the first time. Nia turned her head toward him, considering her response. Then she smiled. "The woman you should have never put in cuffs." Bradley shot up from his chair, the sound of the legs screeching against the floor, cutting through the room like a blade. But it was too late. Outside the door, the phone was ringing. And when Bradley finally answered it, everything they thought they knew would come crashing down. The sound of the ringing phone outside the interrogation room was distant, muffled by the thick walls, but Officer Bradley Huxley heard it like a gunshot. It wasn't just any phone. It was the phone, the direct line from Langley, Virginia. CIA headquarters. Bradley's face twitched, his jaw locked so tight it looked like he was about to break a molar. For the first time that night, the power in the room wasn't his. Nia Caldwell sat perfectly still, her wrists still cuffed to the steel table, her deep brown eyes calm as she watched Bradley's mask begin to crack. She didn't have to say anything. The silence was doing all the work for her. Outside the interrogation room, Officer Ethan Carter hovered by the phone, his fingers gripping the receiver like it was a live wire. His pulse thundered in his ears. The screen on the call box flashed an incoming number, one that wasn't local, wasn't from the state. The prefix alone sent a chill down his spine. 703, Virginia, and not just anywhere in Virginia, Langley, the home of the Central Intelligence Agency. His mouth was dry as he turned toward the precinct captain, George Wilkins, a gruff, square-jawed man with decades of service under his belt. Wilkins frowned as he eyed the call display. "What the hell is this?" Ethan swallowed hard. "Sir, I think we made a mistake." Back inside the interrogation room, the air was thick, electric with unspoken tension. Darren Cole still stood near the door, his posture tense, his arms crossed over his chest as if bracing for impact. He hadn't said a word since Ethan mentioned the phone call. But Nia could see it, the doubt, the realization creeping in. He was starting to understand. Bradley, though, he wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet. His face was red, his nostrils flared, his mind working overtime to find a way out of this mess. His fingers curled against the edge of the table, knuckles white. "All right," he said, his voice tight. "Enough with the games. Who the hell are you?" Nia exhaled slowly, tilting her head just slightly. "Now you're asking the right questions." Bradley slammed his palm against the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Cut the cryptic crap. If you're someone important, why didn't you say something sooner?" Nia smiled, just a hint of it. "Because you never gave me the chance." Darren inhaled sharply, but Bradley wasn't listening to anything but his own frustration. He pushed himself up from his chair so quickly that it scraped against the floor, the screeching noise piercing through the thick air. His eyes flickered toward the door. The call. He wasn't going to answer it. Not yet. Not until he figured out how deep in trouble he actually was. Outside the room, Wilkins finally grabbed the receiver, his gravelly voice clipped. "This is Captain Wilkins, Crestwood PD." The voice on the other end was cold, measured, a voice that didn't waste words. "Captain," the man said, "you have something that belongs to us." Wilkins' stomach knotted. "Who am I speaking to?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. A pause. "Then, this is Special Agent Marcus Langford, CIA Division Chief." Wilkins gripped the phone tighter. Langford wasn't just some agent, he was high level, someone who operated so deep in government clearance that his name didn't appear on anything public. Wilkins turned to Ethan, his expression unreadable. "How bad is it?" Ethan licked his lips, shifting uncomfortably. "Her file is locked under federal clearance. We aren't authorized to access any of it." Wilkins closed his eyes briefly, cursing every bad decision that had led to this moment. "Captain," Langford's voice cut through the silence, "I expect my agent to be released immediately." Wilkins' stomach twisted. "I need to confirm." "You don't need to confirm anything," Langford interrupted. You just need to comply. And that was when Wilkins knew. They had messed up. Badly. Back in the interrogation room, Bradley's breathing had turned shallow, his hands tightening into fists as the weight of the situation finally started pressing down on him. "Bradley?" Darren spoke up for the first time in minutes. "I think we—" "Shut up," Bradley snapped, his voice sharp. "Just shut up." Darren's mouth pressed into a thin line, but he didn't argue. Bradley's gaze flicked back to Nia, frustration warring with panic behind his eyes. She just watched him, calm, unbothered, because she knew how this was going to end. The door burst open. Wilkins stood there, his face hard, his shoulders squared like a man about to deliver bad news. "Uncuff her," he ordered, his voice flat. For a second, Bradley didn't move. His pride wouldn't let him. He clenched his jaw, breathing heavily through his nose. "Now," Wilkins added, sharper this time. Bradley didn't look at Nia as he reached for the key. He didn't want to see the look in her eyes. The sound of metal clicking open filled the silent room. Nia flexed her wrists, rolling them slightly as the stiffness faded. She exhaled softly. And then she stood. She didn't rush, didn't gloat. She just rose to her full height, her posture relaxed, controlled, every movement deliberate. And Bradley, for the first time since this all started, he looked small. Darren swallowed hard. Who the hell is she?" he muttered under his breath. Wilkins turned toward Nia, his expression unreadable. "Agent Caldwell, you're free to go. There's a car waiting outside to escort you." Bradley's head snapped up. "Wait, Agent?" Wilkins shot him a sharp look. "Not another word, Officer Huxley." Bradley's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't argue, because what could he possibly say? Nia took a slow step toward the door, then paused, turning back to Bradley. For a moment, she just studied him. Then she smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "You should have run my name first," she said softly. Bradley said nothing, because he finally understood exactly how badly he had screwed up. Outside the interrogation room, the station was coming apart at the seams. Phones were ringing, voices were raised. A tension so thick it could be cut with a blade filled the space like an invisible storm cloud. Captain George Wilkins stood behind the front desk, his face tight, his grip firm around the receiver of the most important phone call of his career. On the other end of the line, the voice of Special Agent Marcus Langford was cool, controlled, and dangerous. "Let me make this clear," Langford said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who did not repeat himself. "You have unlawfully detained one of my operatives. That means you've obstructed a federal agent in the course of their duty. That means you have interfered with active intelligence operations. That means, Captain Wilkins, that you are now standing on the edge of a very, very steep drop." Wilkins swallowed hard. His fingers gripped the phone tighter, his free hand rubbing at his temple like he could massage away the career-ending disaster unfolding in front of him. "Agent Langford," he started, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I understand this is—" "Don't," Langford interrupted, his tone now ice-cold. "Don't tell me you understand. If you understood, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Wilkins glanced over his shoulder at the interrogation room door. He couldn't see Officer Bradley Huxley inside, but he could picture him perfectly, his face red with frustration, his ego bleeding from the wound of realizing he had just arrested the wrong woman. Wilkins exhaled slowly. "How do we fix this?" he asked. Langford's answer was immediate. "Walk into that room, uncuff my agent, apologize, and then, Captain Wilkins, you better hope to God that's enough." Inside the interrogation room, Nia Caldwell sat calmly, rolling her wrists now that they were free from the metal cuffs. She could feel the shift happening around her, the weight of reality crushing down on the officers who thought they held all the power just minutes ago. Bradley stood near the wall, his arms crossed, his fingers digging into his biceps. His face was unreadable, but his breathing? That was another story. Darren Cole, still standing near the door, looked between Nia and his superior like a man watching a house burn down, but not sure if he should grab a hose or just run. The tension was thick. Nobody spoke. Then, the door slammed open. Captain Wilkins stepped inside, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp, and Nia knew. She had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who just got his spine ripped out over the phone. Wilkins' eyes flicked toward Bradley, who straightened instinctively. "Out," Wilkins ordered. Bradley blinked. "Sir, out!" Bradley clenched his jaw, but he didn't argue. He knew better than to argue. With slow, heavy steps, he walked past Nia, refusing to meet her gaze, his entire posture rigid with humiliation. Darren hesitated, as if waiting for further instructions. Wilkins turned to him. "You too, Cole." Darren hesitated for just a second longer. His eyes flickered toward Nia, searching, like he wanted to say something, like he wanted answers. But in the end, he said nothing. He just nodded once, then followed Bradley out of the room. The door closed behind them. And then, for the first time since she had walked into that station, it was just Nia and the man in charge. Wilkins took a slow breath. His shoulders dropped slightly, the weight of reality settling onto him like a lead vest. He pulled out the chair across from Nia and sat down heavily, resting his forearms on the table. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Not with arrogance, not with authority, with caution. "You're CIA," he finally said. It wasn't a question. Nia leaned back slightly, tilting her head. "Took you long enough." Wilkins exhaled through his nose. "I should have known something was off when Carter ran your name." He paused. "Huxley didn't see the restricted tag on your file?" "Didn't check," Nia said simply. Wilkins closed his eyes briefly. Of course he didn't. He inhaled deeply, like a man preparing to dig his own grave. "Agent Caldwell," he said slowly, carefully, "I want to personally apologize for what happened here tonight." Nia raised an eyebrow. "You want to apologize or you have to." Wilkins' mouth pressed into a thin line. She had him there. "Look," he said, running a hand over his face. "I don't know what you were doing in my city, and I'm smart enough not to ask, but whatever it was, it's obvious we got in the way of something we shouldn't have." Nia didn't reply. She didn't have to. Wilkins sighed, rubbing his temple again. "There's a car waiting for you outside," he continued. "Langford sent it. You're free to go." Nia studied him for a moment longer, then pushed back from the table and stood. She straightened her hoodie, rolling her shoulders slightly to shake off the tension. Wilkins watched her, something almost unreadable in his gaze. "You don't seem surprised," he noted. Nia met his eyes. "I'm not." Wilkins swallowed. "Can I ask you something?" he said carefully. Nia exhaled, then nodded. "Go ahead." Wilkins hesitated, then, "What would have happened if we didn't get that phone call?" Silence. A slow, knowing smile curled at the edges of Nia's lips. "Captain Wilkins," she murmured, "you don't want to know the answer to that question." And with that, she walked out. The air outside was thick and humid, the kind that clung to the skin and made every breath feel heavier. The Crestwood Police Department was still buzzing, officers murmuring in hushed voices as Nia Caldwell stepped through the doors, walking out as a free woman. The station that had been her temporary prison just minutes ago now felt like a crumbling house of cards, its walls barely holding up under the weight of what had just transpired. A black SUV idled at the curb, its windows tinted so dark they swallowed the streetlights whole. Standing beside it, dressed in a sharp black suit with an air of absolute authority, was Special Agent Marcus Langford. Tall, broad-shouldered, his deep brown skin illuminated faintly by the streetlights, Langford wasn't just any federal agent. He was the kind of man people didn't call unless they had a very big problem, or unless they had just made a very big mistake. And tonight, Crestwood PD had made the biggest mistake of their careers. Nia took a slow breath, rolling her shoulders as she stepped toward him. Langford watched her approach, his expression unreadable. Then he exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You always find trouble, don't you, Caldwell?" Nia smirked. "I don't find trouble. It finds me." Langford sighed. "Get in the car." She didn't hesitate. She didn't look back. And as the door shut behind her, the weight of the truth settled over Crestwood like a storm ready to break. Inside the SUV, the air was cool, controlled, in direct contrast to the chaos they had just left behind. The leather seats were smooth, the dashboard clean and minimalist, every inch of the vehicle designed for efficiency. Langford slid into the driver's seat, the engine humming as he pulled away from the curb. For a while, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was loaded, filled with the kind of understanding that didn't need words. Finally, Langford broke the silence. "Do I even want to know why you were out there?" Nia smirked, leaning her head back against the seat. "Probably not." Langford let out a sharp breath, his fingers gripping the wheel tighter. "You do realize what could have happened tonight, right?" he said, his voice edged with something between frustration and concern. If I hadn't been near my phone, if that rookie hadn't checked the system, you could have ended up in a cell, or worse. Nia glanced out the window, watching the city lights blur past. I was never in danger. Langford shot her a look. They didn't know that. She didn't respond. Because he was right. They hadn't known. To them, she had just been another black woman walking in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. Just another person they could throw in the back of a squad car, another body to process through a broken system that saw guilt before it ever considered innocence. Even now, she could still feel the weight of those cuffs around her wrists. She flexed her fingers absently. Langford sighed, shaking his head. "You should have called me sooner." "I handled it," she murmured. He shot her another look. "You shouldn't have had to handle it." Nia's jaw clenched slightly. She hated this part, the part where people who actually cared reminded her that not every battle had to be fought alone. Langford exhaled slowly, the anger in his voice giving way to something heavier. "You know they'll get away with it, right?" he said. "Maybe not entirely, but Bradley, Wilkins, that whole damn precinct, they'll get a slap on the wrist, maybe a temporary suspension. But then, in a few months, they'll be back in uniform, back on the streets." Nia nodded once. "I know. And that doesn't piss you off?" She turned to look at him then, her expression unreadable. "It used to," she admitted. "Now, I just expect it." Langford gritted his teeth, but he didn't argue, because he expected it too. The SUV cruised down the highway, the lights of Crestwood fading behind them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then finally, Langford sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You know what your problem is, Caldwell?" Nia smirked. "Enlighten me." He glanced at her, shaking his head. "You're too damn good at making people underestimate you." She chuckled at that, but there was no real humor in it. "That's not my fault, that's theirs." Langford exhaled through his nose, his grip on the wheel relaxing slightly. "You sure you're all right?" he asked, quieter this time. Nia nodded. "I've been through worse." "Yeah," Langford muttered. "That's what worries me." Back at the Crestwood Police Department, the station was still buzzing with unease. Inside his office, Captain Wilkins sat at his desk, his hands clasped together, his mind racing. Across from him, Bradley Huxley stood rigid, his face set in a hard frown, his jaw clenched so tight he looked like he might crack a tooth. "You understand how bad this looks, right?" Wilkins asked, his voice low, controlled. Bradley scoffed. "Come on, Captain, she is a federal agent." Bradley flinched. Wilkins leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Do you even realize what you just did? If she wanted to, she could have your badge. Hell, she could probably have you sitting in a holding cell right now." Bradley's fists curled at his sides. "So that's it? We just let her walk?" Wilkins sighed, rubbing his temple. "We don't have a choice, and you better pray this doesn't go any higher." Bradley muttered something under his breath, but Wilkins ignored him. Instead, he turned to the doorway, where Darren Cole stood, watching the conversation with something unreadable in his expression. Wilkins narrowed his eyes. "You got something to say, Cole?" Darren hesitated. Then, "We screwed up." Bradley shot him a glare. "Oh, give me a break." "No," Darren cut him off. "No, I mean it. We messed up." Wilkins studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he muttered. "We did." Bradley turned to leave, but Wilkins's voice stopped him. "Where do you think you're going?" Bradley turned back, his jaw tight. Wilkins leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You and we're going to have a long talk about what the hell happens next." And for the first time that night, Bradley Huxley looked afraid. The Crestwood Police Department had never been this quiet. Not even in the dead of night, when the radio chatter slowed and the drunks in the holding cells finally passed out. This was a different kind of silence. A heavy silence. The kind that settled in when something had gone terribly wrong and everyone was waiting to see who would take the fall. Inside his office, Captain George Wilkins sat behind his desk, his hands clasped together, staring at the two men standing in front of him, Officer Bradley Huxley, Officer Darren Cole. One looked furious, the other looked uncertain. And Wilkins looked tired. "Do either of you," he said, his voice slow, deliberate, "have any idea how bad this is?" Bradley scoffed, crossing his arms. "With all due respect, Captain." "Stop," Wilkins cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade. "Just stop." Bradley's mouth snapped shut, but the anger in his eyes didn't fade. Wilkins exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples. I just got off a very unpleasant call with the deputy director of the CIA. Not some desk agent. Deputy director, you know what that means, Huxley? Bradley shifted his weight, but he didn't answer. Wilkins didn't wait for him to. It means we didn't just arrest some nobody. It means we didn't just profile some innocent civilian and get caught. It means we detained, mistreated, and unlawfully restrained a federal operative working on classified business. Darren inhaled sharply, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. Bradley, though, his jaw flexed, and he had the audacity to mutter, "We didn't know." Wilkins's eyes snapped to him, and for the first time in years, Bradley looked away first. "That's your defense?" Wilkins asked, his voice eerily calm. "That you didn't know?" Bradley's fists clenched. "She fit the description." "No, she didn't." Wilkins cut in. Bradley hesitated. "We were just doing our job." Wilkins let out a short, bitter laugh. "Your job? You think your job is to harass, detain, and use unnecessary force on a woman who had committed no crime?" Bradley's face turned red. "Come on, Captain, we've stopped plenty of people for less." And there it was, the truth that sat rotting underneath it all. Darren flinched, but Wilkins just exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Yeah," Wilkins muttered. "You have." Bradley's mouth opened like he was about to argue, but Wilkins was already moving, grabbing a folder from his desk. He tossed it down in front of them. Bradley frowned. "What's this?" "Your suspension papers." The room froze. Bradley blinked, then let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're suspending me?" Wilkins didn't flinch. "Effective immediately. You're relieved of duty until further notice. Badge. Gun. Now." Bradley's face went red. "You can't be serious." Wilkins leaned forward, his expression hard as stone. "Bradley, I should be firing you. You're lucky the CIA isn't pressing federal charges." Bradley clenched his fists, but Wilkins just pointed at his belt. "Badge. Gun. Now." For a moment, it looked like Bradley was going to argue. But then, with a sharp exhale, he ripped his badge from his uniform, slamming it onto the desk. His gun followed right after, hitting the wood with a heavy thud. Wilkins didn't react. He just looked at Darren. "You too." Darren's breath caught. "Captain, You were there," Wilkins said. "You didn't stop it. You let it happen." Darren's stomach twisted, and for the first time he looked truly ashamed. Bradley scoffed. "Come on, Captain. Cole, really? He barely did anything." "Exactly," Wilkins said flatly. "He did nothing." Darren winced, and slowly, without protest, he unhooked his badge and gun, placing them carefully on the desk. Wilkins exhaled through his nose. "Get out, both of you." Bradley didn't move at first. His jaw was clenched so tightly a vein in his neck pulsed. Then, with a sharp turn, he stormed toward the door. Darren followed, but before he stepped out, he hesitated. Then quietly, "I'm sorry, Captain." Wilkins didn't respond, because apologies didn't change a damn thing. The moment the door slammed behind them, Wilkins let out a long, exhausted sigh, his fingers pressing into his temples. "You did the right thing," a voice said. Wilkins looked up. Ethan Carter. The rookie officer stood just outside the office, his expression unreadable. Wilkins huffed. "Doesn't feel like it." Ethan hesitated, then stepped inside. "I should have said something sooner. When I ran her name, I knew something was wrong, but..." He swallowed. "I didn't push hard enough." Wilkins studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Learn from it. Don't make the same mistake twice." Ethan nodded once. Then, "Captain?" Wilkins raised an eyebrow. "Do you think she's coming back?" Wilkins exhaled, his gaze drifting toward the door. "Agent Caldwell," he muttered. Then, after a pause, "God, I hope not." Outside, the night air was heavy, thick with the weight of what had just happened. Bradley stormed across the parking lot, yanking his phone from his pocket. "This is bull," he muttered. "Absolute." "Bradley," Darren said quietly. Bradley turned, furious. "What?" Darren hesitated. Then, "She was right." Bradley's expression darkened. Darren shook his head. "We messed up, man." Bradley's fists curled at his sides. Then, without another word, he walked away. Because the truth was too damn heavy to carry. Crestwood had changed. It wasn't something you could see immediately. Not in the streets, not in the buildings, not in the neon-lit diners or the quiet, tree-lined neighborhoods, but in the way people talked, in the way they watched. A shift had settled over the city like a storm that had passed but left the air charged, heavy with something unspoken. Everyone had heard the story by now. About the two officers, about the woman they arrested, about the phone call that changed everything. And most of all, about the fact that they hadn't realized who they were dealing with until it was too late. Bradley Huxley sat alone in a bar just outside the city limits, nursing a whiskey that he had barely touched. The TV above the counter hummed with the evening news, but he wasn't watching. Not really. Not until Crestwood Police Department has placed 2 officers on indefinite suspension following an internal review. Bradley's grip on his glass tightened. He already knew what they were saying, how they were spinning it. While the department has not officially released names, sources confirm that officers Bradley Huxley and Darren Cole were placed on leave following an incident involving a wrongful detainment. His jaw clenched. According to reports, the individual in question was later revealed to be a federal agent operating under restricted clearance. The situation has raised concerns about racial profiling and misuse of authority within local law enforcement. Bradley shut his eyes. Damn them. Damn the media. Damn the department. Damn her. Darren Cole didn't go to a bar. He went home and sat in silence. He had turned off his phone hours ago, ignoring the calls, ignoring the texts. The worst part wasn't the suspension. It wasn't the news coverage. It wasn't even the way Wilkins had looked at him when he turned in his badge. It was knowing that everything Nia Caldwell had said was true, and that he had done nothing to stop it. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he even deserved to wear a badge. Ethan Carter, the rookie officer who had first flagged Nia's name in the system, sat on a bench outside the station, staring at the pavement. Long night? He looked up. Captain Wilkins stood nearby, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Ethan let out a short, tired laugh. You could say that. Wilkins exhaled through his nose, then sat beside him. You did the right thing, you know, he said after a moment. Ethan let out another breath, staring at the cracks in the pavement. It didn't feel like it at the time. Wilkins nodded slowly. It never does. They sat in silence for a long time. Then, quietly, Wilkins said, You planning to stay in this job? Ethan hesitated. Then, I don't know. Wilkins nodded again. Then you've got a better head on your shoulders than most. Ethan turned to look at him. What about you, sir? Wilkins let out a slow breath. Been asking myself the same question, he muttered. Nia Caldwell stood in a sleek government office in Washington, D.C., her arms crossed as she watched the lights of the city flicker beyond the window. Langford sat behind his desk, flipping through a file, his expression unreadable. So, he finally said, how does it feel? Nia arched a brow. How does what feel? Knowing you scared the hell out of an entire police department. Nia let out a small dot of humorless chuckle. Not the first time, Langford smirked, setting the file down. And yet, you still haven't learned to keep a low profile. Nia turned back toward the window, watching the streets below. She could still feel it. The handcuffs, the weight of them, the way Bradley had shoved her against the car, the way Darren had stood there watching, silent, complicit, the way Wilkins had only cared once the call from Langley came through. They got suspended, Langford said. That's something. Nia exhaled. Not enough. Langford studied her for a long moment. It never is it? Nia didn't answer, because they both already knew the truth. No, it never was. Back in Crestwood, the city kept moving. The bars stayed open, the diners stayed full. People still walked the streets, still lived their lives. But something had changed. Because now, when a police car rolled by, people watched a little closer. Because now, when a black woman walked down the street at night, people remembered her story. Because now, the city understood one simple truth. Justice isn't just about what's done, it's about what happens after. Crestwood moved on. The way cities always do. The streets didn't change overnight. The houses still stood where they had always been, their porches lined with rocking chairs and half-empty flower pots. The bars still opened at sunset, pouring cheap whiskey into the glasses of men who didn't want to go home. And the police? They were still out there, still patrolling, still watching. But now, they were being watched too. People paid attention in a way they hadn't before. They remembered names. They asked questions. They didn't just look away. And that was how change started. Bradley Huxley hadn't worn his uniform in weeks. His suspension was indefinite, but he already knew he wasn't getting his badge back. Not officially, not in writing. But the department had made it clear. They were moving on. and he was a problem they wanted to forget. He sat in his truck outside a gas station on the outskirts of town, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face looked different. Not older, not worn, but smaller. Like something had been stripped away. Like the illusion of power had finally cracked. He thought about Darren, that damn rookie who had the nerve to tell him they were wrong. He thought about Wilkins, about how the old man had looked at him like he wasn't worth the effort anymore. And most of all, he thought about her, that woman, Nia Caldwell. How she had walked into that station in cuffs and walked out untouchable. He had spent his entire career believing he was untouchable. And now, he wasn't even sure who he was anymore. Darren Cole had already made his decision. He wasn't coming back. The badge, the uniform, the weight of it all, it didn't feel the same anymore. It felt wrong. For years, he had convinced himself that being a cop meant something, that it was about protecting people, about doing the right thing. But now, he wasn't so sure. Because when it had mattered most, he had stood there, silent, complicit. And silence wasn't neutral, it was a choice. So he made a different one. He packed up his apartment, he put in his resignation, and he left Crestwood behind. Captain Wilkins stayed. He had spent too many years in that chair to walk away now. But even he knew this was his last run. He had seen the writing on the wall, the world was changing, the rules were shifting, and men like Bradley, they weren't the future, they were the past. So Wilkins made a choice. He started pushing for reforms inside the department. Real ones. He made it clear this would never happen again. And even though he knew it wouldn't erase what had already been done, it was a start. Ethan Carter stayed too. But he changed. He started speaking up. He started asking questions. He started making sure that the next time someone ran a name in the system and saw a red flag, they would think twice before reaching for the cuffs. It wasn't much, but it mattered. And Nia? She kept moving, because that was what she did. She didn't stay in Crestwood. She didn't look back. But as she sat in another city, in another cafe, drinking another cup of coffee, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through the news. And there it was, an article, small, buried under bigger headlines. Former Crestwood police officer resigns amid controversy. Darren, she smirked. Good, because some people could change, and some had to burn out before they could see the light. Justice wasn't about one victory. It wasn't about one woman walking free. It wasn't even about two officers losing their badges. Justice was about what happened next, about what people remembered, about what people refused to ignore. And in Crestwood, people weren't ignoring it anymore. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. This story wasn't just about one woman, one mistake, or one night. It was about a system that thrives on unchecked power and what happens when someone dares to challenge it. But now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed or experienced injustice like this? What would you have done in Nia's place? And most importantly, how do we change a system that protects the wrong people? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation that actually makes a difference. And if you found this story powerful, if it made you think, feel, or question the world around you, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this again. New videos are coming, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's next. Because the truth, this isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call. Subscribe now. Be part of the change.